her manipulation tactics wouldn't work in federal court with criminal charges pending. When proceedings resumed, Sarah presented the most damaging evidence. Sandra's own behavioral documentation turned against her. Every photo, every behavioral log, every piece of manufactured evidence revealed the systematic nature of her manipulation, rather than legitimate concern for Tyler's welfare. Your Honor, Sarah explained, Ms. Williams spent months documenting every aspect of Mr. Johnson's parenting, not to help Tyler, but to build a false. The whole mess started 6 months earlier when Sandra called me at 2 a.m, sobbing into the phone like her world had collapsed. She'd lost her job at some marketing firm in Phoenix and couldn't make rent on her apartment. With 2 kids and nowhere else to turn, she begged me to let them stay, just for a few weeks and until she got back on her feet. I should have known better. Sandra had always been the family manipulator, the one who could twist any situation to make herself the victim. But hearing my 10-year-old niece Chloe crying in the background and knowing my 6-year-old nephew Mason needed a roof over his head, I caved. I drove my pickup truck to their cramped apartment that very night and helped load their belongings. My house in suburban Tucson was plenty big enough. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a decent backyard where Tyler could play. I'd bought it after my divorce from Amanda 2 years ago, thinking Tyler and I needed space to heal and grow together. The mortgage payment stretched my construction manager's salary, but I'd been making it work through careful budgeting and the occasional overtime project. Tyler had been doing well in his new routine. 3rd grade was challenging for him because of his dyslexia, but we'd established a solid homework schedule. Every evening after dinner, we'd sit at the kitchen table and work through his reading assignments together. I'd watch him trace each letter with his finger, sounding out words that came naturally to other kids his age. His teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been incredibly supportive, providing extra materials and celebrating every small victory. Sandra's arrival changed everything. Within a week, she'd taken over the guest bedroom and converted my home office into a playroom for Mason. Chloe, who tested into the gifted program at her new school, claimed the basement den as her study space. Sandra made herself comfortable on my leather couch, remote control in hand, ordering takeout on my credit card, and complaining about the cable package. The grocery bills doubled, then tripled. Sandra had expensive taste and zero consideration for my budget. She'd fill the cart with organic produce, name-brand cereals, and premium ice cream, then shrug when I mentioned the cost. Family takes care of family became her standard response, delivered with that entitled smile I remembered from our childhood. Tyler started struggling with his homework routine. Mason's constant noise and Chloe's academic superiority complex created chaos in our previously peaceful home. Sandra would interrupt Tyler's reading practice to ask me for money gas for my old Honda Civic she'd borrowed indefinitely, or help with some crisis involving her children's school enrollment. The breaking point should have come months sooner, but I kept hoping Sandra would find work and move out. Instead, she grew more comfortable, more demanding. She'd critique my parenting, suggesting Tyler needed professional help for his learning differences. She'd roll her eyes when he struggled with simple sentences, making comments about how Chloe could read chapter books in kindergarten. 3 weeks before the dinner incident, I noticed my bank statements were missing from the mail pile. I'd been expecting them for my monthly budget review, but they never arrived. When I called the bank to request duplicates, the representative mentioned they'd been delivered to my address according to their records. That's when I decided to search Sandra's room. I felt guilty about violating her privacy, but too many things weren't adding up. The missing mail, her confidence about staying longer, her casual remarks about my good job and nice savings account that I'd never discussed with her. What I found in her dresser drawer made my stomach turn. Copies of job applications, all listing my address as her residence. But more disturbing were the bank statement photocopies clearly taken when she intercepted my mail. She'd been studying my financial information for months, documenting my savings account balance, my direct deposit amounts, even my investment portfolio statements. When I confronted her that evening, Sandra didn't even try to deny it. I needed to look stable for job applications, she said, shrugging like identity theft was no big deal. And I figured if I knew your situation, I could better plan how long to stay. I better plan how long to stay, I repeated, incredulous. Bo, you make good money. You've got $37,000 in savings, and your house is worth way more than you paid for it. You can afford to help family. Tyler had been listening from the stairway, and he crept down to ask, Daddy, is Aunt Sandra mad at us because of me? The innocent question cut deeper than any of Sandra's manipulations. My 8-year-old son was blaming himself for the tension in our home, wondering if his learning challenges made him a burden worthy of his aunt's criticism. That night, I realized Sandra hadn't been looking for temporary help. She'd been conducting surveillance, planning a long-term invasion of my life and finances. The dinner confrontation was just the beginning of her true intentions coming to light. The morning after my confrontation with Sandra about the bank statements, our mother Dorothy arrived unannounced. She drove down from Flagstaff in her old Buick, claiming she wanted to check on the family situation and help us work things out peacefully. I should have been relieved to see Mom. Throughout our childhood, she'd been the voice of reason, the elementary school teacher who could mediate any conflict with patience and wisdom. But something felt off about her timing and the way she immediately pulled Sandra aside for a private conversation in the backyard. Dorothy had always favored Sandra making excuses for her poor choices and enabling her manipulation tactics. When Sandra dropped out of college to marry her ex-husband, Mom called it following her heart. When Sandra's marriage fell apart due to her spending habits and controlling behavior, Mom blamed her son-in-law for not being understanding enough. Over coffee that morning, Dorothy started her mediation with what seemed like neutral territory, Tyler's education. I've been thinking about Tyler's learning situation, she said, stirring sugar into her mug with deliberate slowness. Perhaps he needs more specialized attention than you can provide while working full-time. Tyler's doing fine, I replied firmly. His teacher says he's making excellent progress with his reading program. Sandra joined us at the kitchen table wearing an expression of fake concern that I'd learned to recognize. Actually, Bo, I've been wanting to talk to you about Tyler's schooling. I think I could be more involved, maybe attend his parent-teacher conferences since you're always working late. The suggestion made my blood pressure spike, but I tried to stay calm. I've never missed a conference. Tyler's education is my responsibility. Of course it is, Dorothy said quickly. Sandra just wants to help. She has experience with gifted education through Chloe's programs. Maybe she could offer Tyler some additional support. That's when the real manipulation began to surface. Dorothy casually mentioned that she'd discussed my situation with Sandra several times over the past few months. My promotion at the construction company. My salary increased the bonus I'd received for completing the hospital renovation project ahead of schedule. How do you know about my promotion? I asked Mom directly. Dorothy looked uncomfortable. Sandra told me you'd gotten a raise. I was proud of your success. I never told Sandra about the promotion or the bonus. The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra shifted in her chair, suddenly fascinated by her coffee mug. Dorothy realized she'd revealed something she wasn't supposed to know. I may have mentioned it, Dorothy admitted slowly. When Sandra was worried about imposing on you financially, I assured her that you were doing well and could afford to help family. You told her I could afford to support her indefinitely. Not indefinitely, Dorothy protested. Just until she gets established. Sandra's been through so much with the divorce and job loss. She deserves some stability, especially for the children's sake. Sandra seized the opening. Actually, I've been thinking about Tyler's upcoming parent-teacher conference next week. Since you mentioned you might have to work late that day, I could attend in your place. Mrs. Rodriguez and I have talked several times when I've picked Tyler up from school. I hadn't mentioned anything about working late, and Sandra had been picking Tyler up without my permission, inserting herself into his school routine while I was at job sites. I'll be at the conference, I said firmly. Of course you will, Sandra replied smoothly. I just thought it might be helpful to have someone there who's been observing Tyler's after-school behavior, someone who's available during school hours to address any immediate concerns. The phrase, someone who's available, was a deliberate jab at my work schedule. Sandra was positioning herself as the stay-at-home caregiver while painting me as an absent father, too busy to properly care for my son. Dorothy nodded approvingly. It might be good for Tyler to see the family working together on his behalf. Unity is important for children, especially those facing educational challenges. That afternoon, Tyler's school called my office. The secretary, Mrs. Patterson, sounded confused. "Mr. Johnson, I have a Sandra Williams on the phone claiming to be Tyler's guardian. She's requesting his academic records and wants to discuss his placement for next year. Should I speak with her?" My stomach dropped. Absolutely not. I'm Tyler's father and only legal guardian. Please don't release any information to anyone except me. Of course, Mr. Johnson. I was confused because she seemed very familiar with Tyler's situation and mentioned she'd been working with his teacher. When I got home that evening, I confronted Sandra directly. "You called Tyler's school claiming to be his guardians." "I didn't claim to be his guardian," Sandra said defensively. "I said I was family helping with his care." Mrs. Patterson misunderstood. "You requested his academic records. I thought it would be helpful to understand his educational needs better. I'm just trying to help Bo." Dorothy intervened before I could respond. Sandra's heart is in the right place. She's trying to support Tyler's success. But I was beginning to see the pattern. Sandra wasn't just helping with Tyler's care, she was systematically inserting herself into official roles and relationships. The school secretary's confusion suggested Sandra had presented herself as having more authority than she actually possessed. That night, I found Dorothy and Sandra in the kitchen having another private conversation. They stopped talking when I entered, but I caught the tail end of Dorothy's whispered comment. "The paperwork should be straightforward if you document everything properly." "What paperwork?" I asked. "Nothing important," Dorothy replied quickly, "just discussing Sandra's job search documentation." But Sandra's expression suggested they'd been discussing something entirely different, something involving Tyler and official documentation that required careful preparation. I was starting to realize that Mom hadn't come to mediate our family conflict. She'd come to help Sandra execute a plan they'd been developing together, a plan that involved my son, and my inability to see it coming. Tuesday afternoon brought Tyler's parent-teacher conference scheduled for 4:30 to accommodate my work schedule. I left the construction site early, changed out of my work clothes, and arrived at Pine Valley Elementary with 10 minutes to spare. What I found in the school lobby made me question everything I thought I knew about my sister's intentions. Sandra sat in the principal's office through the glass partition surrounded by file folders and official-looking documents. Tyler's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was taking notes while Sandra gestured emphatically about something. Principal Johnson nodded along, occasionally referencing papers from Sandra's collection. I walked directly to the office and knocked on the doorframe. "I'm here for Tyler's conference." The silence that followed was awkward and telling. Mrs. Rodriguez looked confused. Principal Johnson appeared uncomfortable, and Sandra seemed caught off guard despite having clearly planned this moment. "Mr. Johnson," the principal said, standing to shake my hand. "We were just reviewing Tyler's situation with Mrs. Williams. She's provided some very helpful insights into his home environment." "Mrs. Williams." I looked at Sandra, who was now avoiding eye contact. "Sandra isn't married. She's Ms. Williams, and she's Tyler's aunt, not his caregiver." Principal Johnson consulted his notes. "I apologize for the confusion. Ms. Williams indicated she's been Tyler's primary caregiver while you're working. She's brought documentation about Tyler's living situation and some concerns about his educational needs." Sandra finally spoke up. "I wanted to be proactive about Tyler's support system. I've been observing some challenges that might require professional intervention." She opened her main folder and spread papers across the principal's desk. I moved closer to see what she'd prepared, and my anger transformed into something much deeper and more dangerous. Sandra had created a comprehensive file documenting every aspect of my parenting. Photos of Tyler's messy bedroom, timestamps of when I arrived home from work, copies of his homework assignments with my corrections marked in red ink. She'd even included a behavioral log noting Tyler's frustration episodes during reading practice and his emotional dependency on me for academic support. These documents show a pattern of educational neglect, Sandra explained to Principal Johnson. Tyler needs more than Bo can provide while maintaining his demanding work schedule. I've been researching specialized programs that might better serve his needs. Mrs. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Ms. Williams, when we spoke yesterday, you mentioned Tyler might benefit from a different school district, one with more resources for learning differences. Yesterday? I interrupted. You met yesterday? Sandra had visited the school without my knowledge, presenting herself as Tyler's caregiver and discussing major educational changes. She'd scheduled meetings, reviewed his files, and made recommendations about his future, all while I was working to support the family she'd infiltrated. Principal Johnson cleared his throat. Mr. Johnson, Ms. Williams has scheduled Tyler for psychological evaluation next Monday. She indicated you'd approved the assessment to determine his educational placement needs. I never approved any evaluation. I have the signed consent form, Sandra said, producing another document from her folder. I examined the paper closely. My signature was there, but I'd never seen the document before. The handwriting looked like mine, but something felt wrong about the pen strokes and letter formation. Where did I supposedly sign this? Last week when you were reviewing Tyler's homework folder, Sandra replied smoothly. You signed several school documents. I thought you realized what they were. It was brilliant and terrifying. Sandra had mixed the evaluation consent form with routine homework acknowledgments, banking on my trust and busy schedule to get my signature on something I'd never read. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up nervously. Mr. Johnson, there's something else. Ms. Williams requested Tyler's complete academic and medical records be transferred to Wilson Elementary in the Riverside District. She indicated the family was relocating. We're not relocating. Sandra's carefully constructed story was unraveling, but she pressed forward. Bo, we discussed this. The rental situation here isn't sustainable long-term, and Tyler would benefit from Wilson's special education resources. We never discussed anything remotely like that. Principal Johnson was clearly realizing he'd been manipulated. Mr. Johnson, I think we need to clarify some authorization issues. Who has legal custody and educational decision-making authority for Tyler E? I do. I'm his father and sole legal guardian. Sandra is my sister staying temporarily in my house. The principal turned to Sandra. Ms. Williams, you indicated you had legal authority to make educational decisions for Tyler. I said I was involved in his care, Sandra replied, her confidence finally cracking. I never claimed legal authority. But the consent form's record requests and evaluation scheduling suggested otherwise. Sandra had systematically misrepresented her role to school officials, creating the impression that she had decision-making power over Tyler's education. Mrs. Rodriguez looked mortified. I apologize, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Williams was very knowledgeable about Tyler's situation and seemed to have your approval for these decisions. I realized Sandra had been cultivating relationships with Tyler's teacher and school staff for weeks, positioning herself as his primary advocate while I was working. She'd learned their procedures, built trust, and exploited my absence to gain unofficial authority over my son's educational future. The folder of documentation wasn't just about Tyler's learning challenges. It was evident Sandra had been building a case that I was an inadequate parent, too busy working to properly support my son's special needs. The photos, behavioral logs, and academic concerns painted a picture of neglect that could justify removing Tyler from my care. As I sat in that principal's office surrounded by Sandra's manufactured evidence and forged permissions, I finally understood the scope of her plan. This wasn't about temporary housing or family support. Sandra was systematically documenting my perceived failures as a father while positioning herself as Tyler's salvation. The psychological evaluation she'd scheduled wasn't to help Tyler. It was to create official documentation of his struggles under my care, establishing grounds for a custody challenge that would give her permanent control over my son and access to the child support payments that would come with guardianship. Principal Johnson was reviewing Sandra's paperwork with growing concern. "Mr. Johnson, I think we need to suspend any actions based on these documents until we verify proper authorization. And we should probably schedule a new conference with just you and Mrs. Rodriguez." As we left the school that afternoon, I realized Sandra's manipulation had extended far beyond my household finances. She'd infiltrated Tyler's educational environment, created false documentation, and forged my consent for psychological evaluation that could be used against me in court. The woman I'd trusted with my home and my son had been systematically building a case to take him away from me entirely. That Friday evening, while Sandra was at Chloe's parent night at the middle school, I decided to search her room more thoroughly. What I'd found at the school had convinced me that her documentation project went deeper than educational concerns. Hidden beneath sweaters in her dresser drawer, I discovered a manila envelope that contained the most chilling evidence yet of Sandra's true intentions. Legal paperwork, official forms from the Pima County Family Court, a consultation summary from Bradley and Associates Family Law dated just 2 weeks earlier, and most disturbing of all, a detailed custody petition that painted me as an unfit father, incapable of caring for a child with special needs. The petition was professionally written, clearly prepared by an attorney familiar with family law tactics. It documented every late pickup from school, every evening I'd worked past 6 o'clock, every moment Tyler had struggled with homework under my guidance. Sandra had been building this case for months, creating a paper trail that portrayed my work schedule as neglect and Tyler's learning challenges as evidence of inadequate support. The most damaging section described Tyler's emotional distress caused by an unstable home environment and lack of educational advocacy. Sandra claimed Tyler had confided in her about feeling stupid and behind compared to other children, allegedly due to my impatience with his reading difficulties. None of it was true, but it was written with enough legal sophistication to sound convincing. The petition requested emergency temporary custody based on immediate educational and emotional needs that required full-time caregiving I supposedly couldn't provide. My hands shook as I read the financial sections. Sandra had calculated Tyler's potential child support payments, documenting my income and assets with the precision of an accountant. She'd researched state guidelines and determined exactly how much money she'd receive as Tyler's guardian. But the most shocking discovery was a letter from Dorothy written on official school district letterhead from her retirement address. Mom had provided a character reference supporting Sandra's petition, describing me as overwhelmed by single parenthood, and Tyler as suffering academically due to lack of appropriate intervention. Dorothy had used her credentials as a retired educator to legitimize Sandra's custody grab. Her letter carried the weight of professional educational assessment, making Sandra's claims seem credible to family court judges who might not investigate further. I found more documents, email printouts showing Sandra had consulted with 3 different family law attorneys, shopping for someone willing to take her case. She'd provided each lawyer with identical information packages, complete with photographs of Tyler struggling with homework and behavioral charts documenting his regression under my care. The consultation notes revealed Sandra's strategy in brutal detail. She planned to file for emergency custody during my busiest work period, when the hospital construction project required 60-hour weeks. She'd request immediate placement based on Tyler's urgent educational needs and my inability to provide adequate supervision. One attorney had advised her to document Tyler's psychological evaluation results, which explained her rush to schedule school assessments. If the evaluation showed any learning delays or emotional concerns, Sandra could use those findings to support her custody petition. Most chilling was her backup plan. If the custody petition failed, Sandra intended to file complaints with Child Protective Services alleging educational neglect and emotional abuse. She'd prepared witness statements from Dorothy and even Chloe, who would testify about Tyler's homework struggles and my frustrated responses to his learning difficulties. The CPS reports would create an official investigation file regardless of whether the allegations had merit. Sandra knew that even unfounded CPS cases could be used in future custody battles, creating a pattern of concerns about my parenting abilities. My phone rang as I was photographing Sandra's documents with my cell phone camera. The caller ID showed my attorney's office, which seemed impossibly coincidental until I answered. Mr. Johnson, this is Sarah Martinez. I received an interesting call today from an attorney representing your sister. He indicated you might be expecting custody litigation involving your son Tyler. My stomach dropped. What did he tell you? He claimed your sister has been Tyler's primary caregiver for 6 months and is concerned about filing for formal custody. He suggested we discuss settlement options before court proceedings become necessary. Sandra's attorney was already making moves testing whether I had legal representation and gauging my willingness to fight. The call to my lawyer was a tactical probe designed to assess my defensive capabilities. Ms. Martinez, I need to see you immediately. My sister has been planning to steal my son, and she's built an extensive case against me. That weekend, I met with Sarah Martinez and her colleague, a private investigator named Frank Morrison, who specialized in family law cases. Frank was a former police detective who understood custody manipulation tactics. After reviewing Sandra's documents, Frank's assessment was grimmer than I'd hoped. She's done this before, he said grimly. The level of documentation and legal preparation suggests experience with custody litigation. Frank's background check on Sandra revealed a disturbing pattern. Her divorce from her ex-husband had involved similar tactics. False allegations of child neglect manufactured evidence of his unfitness as a father and systematic documentation of his parenting failures. Sandra's ex-husband had eventually won custody of their children, but only after 18 months of expensive legal battles and court-ordered psychological evaluations. The case files showed Sandra had used identical strategies, positioning herself as the children's advocate while portraying their father as neglectful and emotionally unstable. Even more disturbing was Frank's discovery of Sandra's employment history. She hadn't been laid off from the marketing firm as she'd claimed. Human resources records showed she'd been terminated for embezzling client funds and falsifying expense reports. Sandra had stolen over $12,000 from her employer, using company credit cards for personal expenses and creating fake receipts to cover her theft. The marketing firm hadn't pressed criminal charges in exchange for her resignation, but they'd reported the embezzlement to future employer background checks. Your sister is a professional manipulator, Frank explained. She's been supporting herself through fraud and custody manipulation for years. Tyler isn't her nephew. He's her next target. Sarah Martinez outlined Sandra's likely legal strategy. She'll file for emergency custody on Monday morning, requesting immediate placement pending full custody evaluation. The emergency hearing will happen within 72 hours before you have time to prepare adequate defense. Can she win? If she gets the right judge and presents her evidence effectively, yes. Emergency custody standards favor protecting children from immediate harm. Her documentation makes you look neglectful, even if the evidence is manufactured. That night, I sat in Tyler's bedroom watching him sleep peacefully, unaware that his aunt was planning to steal him away from the only parent he'd known since Amanda moved to California. Tyler trusted Sandra had no idea she viewed him as a financial resource rather than a beloved nephew. Frank's investigation had revealed Sandra's true motivation. She'd been collecting government assistance using Tyler as her dependent for the past 2 months, fraudulently claiming guardianship to receive food stamps, housing assistance, and child care subsidies. But the real prize was permanent custody. As Tyler's guardian, Sandra would receive significant child support payments from me, while maintaining access to my house and financial resources. She'd calculated that Tyler was worth approximately $3,000 per month in combined support and benefits. My son had become Sandra's business plan, a vehicle for long-term financial security that would allow her to avoid working while living comfortably on court-ordered payments from my construction income. As I tucked Tyler's blanket around his sleeping form, I realized Sandra's most devastating weapon wasn't her legal paperwork or manufactured evidence. It was Tyler's genuine affection for his aunt and his innocent trust that adults had his best interests at heart. If Sandra succeeded in convincing Tyler that living with her would be better for his education and emotional well-being, my own son might testify against me in family court. And given Tyler's learning struggles and desire to please authority figures, Sandra's manipulation could easily convince an 8-year-old that choosing her was the right decision for everyone. The custody battle wasn't just about legal strategy and evidence. It was about Sandra's willingness to psychologically manipulate a vulnerable child to achieve her financial goals, regardless of the emotional damage she might inflict on Tyler or me. Monday morning, I took a personal day from the construction site and spent it in Sarah Martinez's downtown office planning our legal counteroffensive. Frank Morrison had worked through the weekend gathering evidence, and what he'd discovered gave us powerful ammunition against Sandra's custody scheme. "We need to move fast," Sarah explained, spreading documents across her conference table. "Sandra filed her emergency custody petition this morning at 8:15. The hearing is scheduled for Wednesday at 10 a.m. Frank opened his investigation folder. "I've got enough evidence to not only defeat her custody petition, but to file criminal charges for fraud and child endangerment." The first bombshell was Sandra's financial fraud. Frank had traced her government assistance claims and discovered she'd been collecting benefits using Tyler as her dependent since July, 2 months after moving into my house. She'd provided false documentation claiming legal guardianship and fabricated living expenses to increase her assistance payments. She'd stolen approximately $4,000 in fraudulent benefits, Frank reported. Food stamps, housing assistance, and emergency child care vouchers all claimed using Tyler's information. But the fraud went deeper. Sandra had opened a credit card in Tyler's name, using his social security number and my address to establish credit history. She'd charged over $2,000 in personal expenses before I discovered the account during my weekend document review. "Identity theft of a minor is a federal crime," Sarah noted. "We can file charges that carry significant prison time." Frank's investigation had also uncovered Sandra's pattern of manipulation with other family members. Her ex-husband provided detailed testimony about similar custody tactics, including forged documents, false allegations, and manufactured evidence of parental unfitness. "She tried this exact strategy with her own children," Frank explained. "Emergency custody petition, professional documentation, character assassination of their father. The only difference is she's gotten more sophisticated with her legal preparation." Most damaging was Frank's discovery of Sandra's recordings. Hidden throughout my house, Sandra had placed small digital recorders designed to capture conversations she could edit and use as evidence of my alleged verbal abuse toward Tyler. Frank found 5 recording devices, one in the kitchen where Tyler and I worked on homework, one in his bedroom, one in the living room where we watched television together, and 2 in my home office where I handled his school communications. "She's been recording you for months," Frank said grimly. "But here's the good news. She made a crucial mistake." The recordings captured not only my conversations with Tyler, but also Sandra's private phone calls with her attorney and Dorothy. Frank's audio analysis revealed Sandra discussing her manipulation strategy, her financial motivations, and her plans to disappear with Tyler if the custody petition succeeded. In one particularly damning recording, Sandra told her attorney, "If I can get temporary custody, I'll take Tyler to Nevada where my cousin lives. Bo will never find us, and by the time he does, Tyler will be settled in a new school and won't want to leave." The audio evidence proved Sandra's custody petition wasn't about Tyler's welfare. She was planning to kidnap my son and relocate him across state lines to prevent me from regaining custody. "That's federal kidnapping conspiracy," Sarah explained. "Combined with her fraud charges, Sandra is looking at serious prison time." Frank had also investigated Dorothy's involvement in Sandra's scheme. Mom's retirement benefits were being garnished for outstanding debts, leaving her financially desperate. Sandra had promised Dorothy a share of the child support payments in exchange for her cooperation with the custody petition. "Your mother isn't just enabling Sandra's manipulation," Frank said. "She's financially invested in stealing Tyler away from you." The evidence was overwhelming, but Sarah warned that winning the legal battle was only part of our challenge. "Sandra has convinced Tyler that she's trying to help his education. We need to protect him from psychological manipulation during the court proceedings." We developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, we'd file criminal charges against Sandra for fraud, identity theft, and kidnapping conspiracy. The criminal case would strengthen our position in family court by establishing Sandra's criminal intent. Second, we'd request emergency protection orders preventing Sandra from contacting Tyler's school, accessing his medical records, or making any decisions about his care. The protection orders would immediately halt her unauthorized involvement in Tyler's life. Third, Frank would document Sandra's current living situation and financial status, proving she couldn't provide stable housing or support for Tyler even if she gained custody. Most importantly, Sarah emphasized, we need to expose Sandra's manipulation to the family court judge before she can present her case as legitimate concern for Tyler's welfare. Tuesday afternoon, Frank and I confronted Sandra's most vulnerable weakness, her complete lack of preparation for actual child care. Despite claiming to be Tyler's primary caregiver, Sandra had no plan for supporting him financially without access to my resources. Frank's investigation revealed Sandra owed over $30,000 in credit card debt, had been evicted from her previous apartment for non-payment, and had no income source beyond government assistance fraud. Her ex-husband was pursuing her for unpaid child support, and she had outstanding warrants for bad checks in 2 counties. She can't afford to support Tyler for even 1 month, Frank explained. Her entire plan depends on receiving child support payments from you while maintaining access to your house and resources. We also discovered Sandra's backup manipulation strategy. If the custody petition failed, she planned to claim Tyler had been sexually abused and needed protection from my inappropriate behavior. Frank found draft CPS reports in Sandra's computer complete with false allegations designed to trigger automatic custody removal. She's prepared to destroy Tyler psychologically to achieve her financial goals, Frank said with disgust. False abuse allegations would traumatize him permanently, but Sandra views that as acceptable collateral damage. Tuesday evening, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. Sarah and Frank recommended immediately removing Tyler from my house to prevent Sandra from manipulating him further or implementing her kidnapping plan. My best friend Frank agreed to let Tyler stay at his house until the custody hearing, protecting him from Sandra's psychological manipulation while keeping him in familiar surroundings with people he trusted. Tyler needs to be safe from Sandra's influence, Sarah explained. If she convinces him to testify against you, even innocent statements could be twisted to support her custody petition. That night, I explained to Tyler that he'd be staying with Frank for a few days, while some grown-up problems got resolved. Tyler was confused but trusted my judgment, packing his favorite books and asking when he could come home. "Soon, buddy," I promised, hoping I was telling the truth. As Tyler gathered his belongings, Sandra watched from the living room with poorly concealed rage. Her carefully planned timeline was being disrupted, and she realized her manipulation was being exposed. "You're making a mistake," she told me quietly. "Tyler needs stability, not more disruption." "Tyler needs protection from people who view him as a paycheck," I replied. Wednesday morning arrived with the weight of everything I'd worked for hanging in the balance. Tyler's future. My rights as his father and Sandra's freedom would all be decided in a family courtroom where truth would finally confront manipulation. But I was no longer the unsuspecting victim Sandra had been planning to destroy. I was a father armed with evidence, legal representation, and the determination to protect my son from a woman who'd been willing to sacrifice his emotional well-being for her financial security. The battle for Tyler's future was about to begin. Wednesday morning's family court hearing would normally have been a private proceeding, but Frank Morrison had convinced the prosecutor's office to coordinate with our custody defense. When Sandra walked into the courthouse expecting a routine emergency custody hearing, she found herself facing both family court proceedings and federal criminal charges. Judge Patricia Hendricks called the session to order at 10 a.m. sharp. Sandra's attorney, a public defender named Robert Chen, who clearly hadn't been briefed on the scope of evidence against his client, looked increasingly uncomfortable as Sarah Martinez presented our counter-petition. "Your Honor," Sarah began, "we're requesting immediate dismissal of Ms. Williams' custody petition based on evidence of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping." Sandra's confidence visibly cracked as Sarah introduced Frank's investigation findings. The fraudulent government assistance claims the credit card opened in Tyler's name. The recordings that captured Sandra discussing her kidnapping plans. Each piece of evidence dismantled another aspect of her carefully constructed case. Judge Hendricks examined the audio transcripts with growing concern. Ms. Williams, these recordings suggest you plan to relocate the child across state lines without the father's consent. Can you explain this strategy? Sandra's attorney requested a brief recess to consult with his client. Through the courtroom glass, I watched them argue in heated whispers. Sandra was clearly realizing her manipulation tactics wouldn't work in federal court with criminal charges pending. When proceedings resumed, Sarah presented the most damaging evidence Sandra's own behavioral documentation turned against her. Every photo, every behavioral log, every piece of manufactured evidence revealed the systematic nature of her manipulation, rather than legitimate concern for Tyler's welfare. Your Honor, Sarah explained, Ms. Williams spent months documenting every aspect of Mr. Johnson's parenting, not to help Tyler, but to build a false case for custody that would provide her with approximately $3,000 per month in support payments. Frank testified about Sandra's criminal history, her embezzlement from the marketing firm, and her identical tactics during her own divorce proceedings. The pattern of manipulation was undeniable and devastating. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Hendricks reviewed Tyler's actual academic records. Mrs. Rodriguez had provided documentation showing Tyler's consistent progress in reading his improved confidence and his positive response to my involvement in his education. Mr. Johnson, the judge addressed me directly. Tyler's teacher describes you as an engaged, supportive parent who attends every conference and volunteers for school events. This contradicts Ms. Williams' allegations of neglect. Sandra's attorney made a final desperate argument about my work schedule and Tyler's need for full-time supervision. But Frank's evidence showed Sandra had been unemployed and living off government assistance while claiming to provide child care she couldn't afford to maintain. Judge Hendricks delivered her ruling with unusual directness. Ms. Williams's petition is denied entirely. Furthermore, I'm ordering immediate protective measures preventing any contact with the child pending criminal proceedings. But the courtroom drama was just the beginning. As we left the courthouse, federal agents were waiting to arrest Sandra on fraud charges. The sight of handcuffs being applied to his aunt would have traumatized Tyler, but Frank had wisely kept him away from the proceedings. That afternoon, Dorothy arrived at my house in tears. She'd been cooperating with federal investigators and finally understood the scope of Sandra's manipulation, including how she'd been used as an accomplice in the custody scheme. I thought I was helping Tyler. Dorothy sobbed in my kitchen. Sandra convinced me you were overwhelmed and needed family support. I never realized she was planning to steal him. Dorothy's confession revealed the depth of Sandra's psychological manipulation. She'd convinced our mother that Tyler was suffering under my care, that his learning struggles indicated neglect, and that Sandra's intervention was necessary for his welfare. She showed me photos of Tyler crying during homework time. Dorothy explained. Sandra said you got frustrated and made him feel stupid. I believed her because she seemed so concerned about his education. But Frank's recordings had captured Sandra staging those photos, deliberately upsetting Tyler during homework sessions, and photographing his tears as evidence of my alleged impatience. Tyler's crying had nothing to do with my parenting, and everything to do with Sandra's manipulation for her camera. The most heartbreaking revelation was Sandra's manipulation of Chloe and Mason. She'd coached them to testify about Tyler's sadness and my anger problems, preparing them to lie in court to support her custody petition. She told Chloe that Tyler would get better help if he lived with us permanently, Dorothy said. She convinced the children they were rescuing their cousin from a bad situation. Over the following days, the full scope of Sandra's fraud investigation unfolded. Federal agents discovered she'd been running similar schemes in 3 other states targeting divorced fathers with valuable assets and vulnerable children. Sandra's ex-husband flew in from Texas to provide testimony about her previous manipulation tactics. His children, now teenagers, described the psychological trauma of being used as weapons in their mother's custody schemes. "She convinced me my dad didn't love me," Chloe told investigators during her interview. "Mom said Dad was too busy working to care about my education, and that living with her would be better for my future." The psychological evaluation Sandra had scheduled for Tyler became evidence of her manipulation rather than his needs. Dr. Patricia Wells, the child psychologist, testified that Tyler showed no signs of neglect or emotional distress related to my parenting. "Tyler is a well-adjusted child with normal responses to learning challenges," Dr. Wells reported. "His relationship with his father is secure and supportive. The anxiety he displayed during evaluation sessions was related to family conflict, not parental inadequacy." Most importantly, Tyler himself was protected from the worst details of Sandra's manipulation. Frank and Sarah worked with child services to ensure Tyler received counseling support without being traumatized by knowledge of his aunt's true intentions. Tyler's main concern was whether he'd caused the family problems. In his 8-year-old logic, Sandra's criticism of his learning differences had convinced him he was a burden that created conflict between the adults he loved. "Am I the reason Aunt Sandra is sad?" Tyler asked during one of our conversations after the court proceedings. "No, buddy," I assured him. "Aunt Sandra made some very bad choices that had nothing to do with you. You didn't cause any of this." The therapy sessions helped Tyler process the family disruption without blaming himself for adult manipulation he couldn't understand. Dr. Wells worked with him to rebuild confidence in his learning abilities and trust in our family relationships. As Sandra's criminal case proceeded through federal court, more evidence emerged of her systematic fraud and manipulation. She'd been targeting single fathers for years, using their children as leverage for financial gain, while showing complete disregard for the psychological damage she inflicted. Her pattern was always the same: insert herself into vulnerable families, build documentation of parental inadequacy, file for custody based on child welfare concerns, and disappear with the children and support payments once she gained legal control. But Tyler's case was different because Sandra had gotten greedy and careless. Her extensive documentation and recording devices had captured her own criminal intent, providing prosecutors with unprecedented evidence of custody fraud conspiracy. In November, Sandra pleaded guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 4 years in prison. Her plea agreement included restitution payments and permanent forfeiture of any rights to contact Tyler or access information about his welfare. Dorothy's cooperation with federal investigators resulted in her receiving probation rather than prison time, but the emotional damage to our family relationship required months of healing. Mom had been manipulated by Sandra's expertise, but she'd also enabled the attack on my parenting and Tyler's security. "I failed you both," Dorothy admitted during one of our family therapy sessions. "I should have trusted your judgment about Tyler instead of believing Sandra's manufactured concerns." The resolution brought justice, but it also brought profound relief. Tyler would grow up safe from Sandra's manipulation, able to trust that the adults in his life genuinely cared about his welfare, rather than viewing him as a source of income. As I watched Tyler reading a chapter book he'd chosen himself, sounding out difficult words with patience and determination, I realized Sandra's greatest failure had been underestimating the strength of our father-son bond and Tyler's innate resilience. She'd seen Tyler's learning differences as weakness she could exploit. Instead, they'd become sources of strength that helped us both weather her manipulation and emerge closer than ever. By Christmas morning, 6 months after Sandra's arrest and 4 months into her federal prison sentence, Tyler and I had built a new routine that felt stronger and more peaceful than anything we'd known before the invasion of our lives. Tyler's academic progress had accelerated dramatically once the family stress disappeared. With specialized tutoring support and continued work with Dr. Wells, he'd gained 2 full reading levels and developed genuine enthusiasm for learning that had nothing to do with comparing himself to other children. The morning sun streamed through our kitchen windows as Tyler carefully sounded out words from his new chapter book, a fantasy adventure about a young wizard who discovered his magical abilities, despite being told he wasn't smart enough for magic school. "Daddy, this character reminds me of someone," Tyler said with a grin, looking up from his book. "Really, who?" "Me. He keeps trying even when people say mean things about his learning." The transformation in Tyler's confidence had been remarkable to witness. Dr. Wells explained that children who survive family manipulation often develop unusual emotional strength and empathy qualities that would serve Tyler well throughout his life. Dorothy had moved back to Flagstaff but visited every other weekend, working hard to rebuild trust and demonstrate genuine support for Tyler's progress. The family therapy sessions had helped her understand how Sandra's manipulation had exploited her natural desire to help while blinding her to the damage being inflicted. "I'm proud of how you protected Tyler," Mom told me during her December visit. "I should have seen through Sandra's lies, but you never stopped fighting for your son." Dorothy's relationship with Tyler had slowly healed as she proved, through consistent actions, that her love was genuine rather than manipulative. She attended his school events, celebrated his reading victories, and most importantly, never criticized his learning pace or compared him to other children. The legal aftermath had brought unexpected benefits beyond Sandra's imprisonment. Frank's investigation had uncovered Sandra's financial crimes against other families, leading to a victim restitution fund that helped cover Tyler's therapy costs and educational support services. More significantly, Tyler's school district had implemented new policies protecting children from unauthorized educational advocacy. Mrs. Rodriguez had become an advocate for family verification procedures that would prevent future Sandra-style manipulation of school systems. Tyler's situation opened our eyes to how easily school officials can be deceived by manipulative family members, Principal Johnson explained. "We've developed protocols that protect both children and their legal guardians from custody manipulation." My relationship with Tyler had deepened through surviving Sandra's attack together. The experience had taught us both that family loyalty must be earned through consistent love and support, not demanded through blood relationships or emotional manipulation. Tyler had learned to trust his own feelings about people rather than automatically believing adults who claimed to care about his welfare. At 9 years old, he possessed emotional wisdom that many adults never develop. "I knew something was wrong about Aunt Sandra," Tyler confided months later. "She said nice things, but they felt different than when you say nice things to me." Frank Morrison had become like an uncle to Tyler, providing positive male role model support while respecting my role as Tyler's father. Frank's protection during the custody crisis had earned Tyler's lasting trust and affection. The construction company had promoted me to senior project manager with a schedule that allowed more flexibility for Tyler's school events and activities. My supervisor, understanding the family crisis we'd survived,